Would you please introduce yourself and state your age?
Yes. My full name is James Lloyd Jones. However, I always have gone by middle name Lloyd, using James only in legal papers and such as that. So people know me as Lloyd Jones. I was 95 years old on February 12th of this year.
Okay. Can we start by talking a little bit about where you were born?
I was born in Garden Grove in an old farmhouse about a mile west of what was then the center of a very small farming town, which was Garden Grove. And I grew up in Garden Grove, having lived there all my life, except for 3 years in the military service in World War II, 3 years in college after I got out of the service, and then 3 years living in the city of Orange when I was first married. I moved back to Garden Grove in 1952, since I had become a permanent teacher and then administrator in the Garden Grove Elementary School District.
Okay. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what life was like when you were a little kid here in Garden Grove growing up?
Well, as I mentioned, this was a country town. There was just a small center of town in the corner of what was then Euclid Avenue and Ocean Avenue, now called Garden Grove Boulevard. About a block of stores on one of the streets and less than a block on the other street. To verify the fact that it was still a country town and some farmers were still using horses and mules, there was actually a blacksmith shop at a point where there is now a store, and I used to see shoes being put on horses when I was growing up. And my father farmed with horses and mules.
Okay. What kinds of things did you like to do as a child?
Well, I was the youngest of 8 children, 2 brothers and 5 sisters. And as I mentioned, my father worked as a day farmer for those farmers who still had horses. And I would go along with him when I wasn't in school and follow him around the field. And if he was cultivating with just one horse down a row of corn, he would put me on the horse's back, and I always enjoyed that. So, and I followed an interest in horses all of my life.
That's great. You mentioned that you had a lot of siblings. What was that like growing up the youngest of 8 kids?
Well, I was the youngest of the 8 children, and there were only 4 of us at home during the years that I remember mostly. Older brother and sisters had married, and some of them lived nearby, but were no longer living at home.
Okay. What is your fondest memory from your childhood?
I think just the fact that as a family we would get together occasionally, enjoy the time together, and gave me an opportunity to become acquainted with my older brother and sisters, even though we were not living together. And in those days, during the 20s and during the 30s, especially during the Depression days in the mid-1930s, we had to learn to get along with just all the basics, and we raised most of our food. We had chickens, we had a cow, sometimes pigs. We had opportunity to grow vegetables and fruit on our property. And as I mentioned, my father worked for farmers, and sometimes we could enjoy part of their crops also. So it was a very basic, down-to-earth life, and everything worked out very well for us. And all this time, I've been a member of Garden Grove Friends Church. And my uncle Clifford Jones was a pastor here in 1909 and 10, and 1917 and 1920. And 1919 was when my family came from Midwest to Garden Grove, which of course was a few years before I was born.
Okay. Is there somebody in your life who you consider to be very influential?
Actually, my parents, mother and father, were very influential. Good Christian folks. They took good care of me. We survived in an area where a lot of people weren't surviving. And just the fact of growing up and then being the youngest in the family and finally the only one at home, my parents were very important to me.
Okay. Did you go to college?
Yes. I had a year and a half at Fullerton Community College before I went in the service. And then after I was out of the service, attended Whittier College for 2.5 years, got a bachelor's degree and a credential for elementary teaching, grades kindergarten through the 8th grade. And then after a year and a half of teaching, I was given a position as a teaching principal in a 6-room school. So then I had to go back to college to get an administrative credential. And I got that credential while attending USC, and ultimately got a master's degree from USC and the bachelor's degree from Whittier College.
Okay. Let's go back just a little bit. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your military experience?
About what?
Your time in the military?
Yes. The first year I was in the Army Signal Corps, and we first studied radio repair work, and then I was sent to what I learned later was supposed to be a secret camp in Florida to learn to do repair work on the ground control approach radar unit, which was used at an airport to assist pilots in landing in bad weather or at night. So it was GCA, and it had a very large antenna, as they call it, a bed spring antenna, which rotated and gave the pilots signals of when to land. Then I was transferred to the Army Air Corps and sent to another camp in Florida where we studied what was called the LORAN, Long Range Navigation Unit. And I learned later that that was a unit used in B-29 bombers. When that training was over, spent some time at an Air Force or Air Corps place in North Dakota, and then on to Seattle, and we boarded a troop ship the last part of November of 1944, and 30 days later ended up at the island of Tinian, and I was on the ground crew of the B-29 bomb group, and we first were dropped off in a field and told to live for 3 days in pup tents. Larger tents were born, and about a month later, our flight crew with the B-29s arrived at Tinian, and a very large airport had been built on the north end of the island. And so then we started maintaining the radar units in the planes, and they began flying bombing missions.
Okay. And how many years did you serve?
Just short of 3 years, just about a month and a half short of 3 years.
So after you returned back to the United States, that's when you went to college and
Yes,
started
went to
teaching?
Whittier College, yes.
Okay. Would you share a little bit about your first teaching job?
About what?
Your first teaching job?
Oh, yes. I had studied just for teaching regular students, but a longtime friend of my family, a man named Warren Mendenhall, was an assistant superintendent in the Orange County Schools Office. And this was in the late 40s. And I think only one school district at that time had any kind of a program for handicapped students. And none of the schools were very large, of course, because Orange County still was primarily farming. And Mr. Mendenhall had discovered that there were some mentally and emotionally handicapped children who had not been placed in schools. And so he knew that I had just finished college. He had started 2 classes at what had been a vacant school building in the city of Orange. He wanted to start a new class, fortunately, just at the time I was through college. So he offered me a position teaching those handicapped students. It was not easy because, as I say, I wasn't trained for handicap, but it was a great experience, and it led to a very important part of my career later on. So I taught there for 1 semester, and then the superintendent, a man named Mr. O.A. Peters, in Garden Grove Elementary District, came to see me and offered me a job teaching in a school in Garden Grove, which had been a segregated Mexican school. At that time in Orange County, there were 11 districts in Orange County which had schools that were segregated for Mexican children only. At that time, there were lots and lots of Mexican families who came to work in Southern California. And one of the Mexican families in the city of Westminster brought a lawsuit against these schools and won the lawsuit, which eliminated segregation, which was a very good thing. And I had the good fortune of teaching in that segregated school in Garden Grove the first year it was open. And the Mexican students were mixed in very nicely in the 4 elementary schools we had with American folks in them, and there were Japanese farmers and Japanese children. So we were able to integrate very successfully. The following year, Mr. Peters asked me to be a teaching principal of a 6-room school that had just been built. And so that was the start of my administrative career.
So how long did you work in the Garden Grove School District then?
Until I retired in 1984. I was a teaching principal for 3 years, full-time principal for 1 year when the school was doubled in size, and then I was promoted to the position of assistant superintendent in 1954. At first, because the district was growing so rapidly, I was given the title assistant superintendent of special needs, which mainly involved employing teachers, because by that time we were building or planning 5 or 6 schools a year. And the district grew very rapidly as orange groves disappeared and subdivisions sprang up. And so I was involved for about 10 years with the employment of teachers and other employees and public relations and that sort of thing. And then in 1965, the Garden Grove Elementary District unified with the Alamitos Elementary District and the Garden Grove High School District. So suddenly, it was a large district, and the three districts were coming together. And so I was able to, by getting a couple of more credentials, to stay at the unified level. And because of my brief experience with those handicapped students, I was placed in charge of special education programs and services, because by that time, lots of handicapped children were showing up and we eventually had classes for about 8 different handicapping conditions. And at one time, when our district was at its largest, 74 schools and 50,000 students, we had 3,600 students just in special education programs. Special needs, it's called now. Then we referred to separate handicapping conditions, but special needs. So it filled a very much needed condition, and it was very gratifying because we could work with parents who were concerned about how their children were going to learn, and we could tell them that we had special programs that would fit all of these various needs.
That's great. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your family life?
Growing up,
Well, when you got married and
right.
started a family.
My wife and I were married in 1949. We have 3 daughters. All became educators, all became teachers. And as we lived in Garden Grove for all those years, we stayed members of what was in Alameda's Friends Church, now Garden Grove Friends Church. And my wife was a wonderful lady in helping the children grow and develop, and eventually she became a substitute teacher. So we were a family of educators, and as I mentioned, all 3 of my daughters became educators. And unfortunately, she was a victim of early onset Alzheimer's disease and passed away at the age of 67. And then 2 years later, I remarried. So the family was together in Garden Grove for quite a number of years. And 2 of my daughters still live in Garden Grove.
So you guys have some deep roots
Yes,
here.
They're a great help.
Oh, that's great. Can you share some of your fondest memories from your middle years? Maybe a favorite vacation your family went on, or?
Yes, we had a little travel trailer and made lots of trips around the country, liked to go camping, and had good times like that.
Good. Do you have a favorite time of year, a favorite season?
Oh, it's hard to say. So many different things have happened over my lifetime at different times of the year. I've always enjoyed education, and a few years after I retired from the school district, I was offered a position as an adjunct professor in graduate education with Azusa Pacific University, and I did that for 25 years, traveling around to different school districts, working with teachers who were enrolled in graduate courses to become administrators. And I was fortunate in being able to work with some teachers right here in Garden Grove that I employed initially. So that the matter of education has always been important.
All right. What are some of the hobbies that you have enjoyed? Hobbies that you enjoy doing or have enjoyed throughout your lifetime?
Well, as I mentioned, I grew up around horses and mules, so always enjoyed horses. And when my daughters were growing up, we had horses, and they rode in horse shows, and we've ridden on guest ranches in a couple of different states, and had an opportunity to ride in a couple of actual cow-calf roundups in Arizona at a ranch belonging to a friend of my nephew's. So we've always enjoyed having horses at various times in our lives.
And if I recall, music is another great passion of yours.
Well, I've enjoyed singing all of my life. Been involved in vocal music, singing in elementary and high school choirs and church children's and adult choirs. Sang in choir at Fullerton College, and when I was in the military service, for a brief time when I was at a station in Macon, Georgia, waiting transfer, I sang with a military choir, 75 men, I think, and the leading soloist was a young man who had been a vocalist with Fred Waring and his half a hundred Pennsylvanians, a very famous musical group in the 30s and 40s and 50s. He had a great orchestra, very well known, and I was able to sing in church choirs as a youngster and as an adult, and I had a total of about 35 or 36 years of singing in barbershop music, barbershop quartet in the Garden Grove School District, and then for about 27 or 8 years sang in it's called the Orange Empire Chorus. It was a barbershop chorus based in Fullerton, and sang in a group. One time we had about 65 singers, and then I sang in different quartets in that group, including one for about 10 years. So vocal music has always been a big part of my life.
When you thought about retirement, was there anything in particular you had planned to do when you retired?
No, the main thing was taking care of my wife as her condition worsened.
All right. What is your daily life like now?
Well, right now I'm recovering from some health problems and enjoying here at the gardens. Basically, when I'm home and well, activities at home and staying active in church. As I mentioned, been a member all my life of Garden Grove Friends Church, and making sure that everything is going well with family and having family get-togethers and that sort of thing.
Okay. As you mentioned, you're at Quaker or Rowntree Gardens right now. Can you share a little bit about your part in establishing Quaker Gardens?
Yes, I was fortunate. From 1948 to 1961, we had a pastor at Garden Grove Friends Church. His name is Eugene Coffin, very well known among Friends churches. Excellent pastor and a man with considerable foresight. And in 1960, he got 4 or 5 of us together in the Garden Grove Friends Church, which was quite large then, and began to talk about possibility of having a Christian retirement facility for older folks, because he knew there were quite a lot of people in our church who were aging. And so we began to talk about that, and we discovered at the same time that Whittier Friends Church, which I think at one time the largest Friends Church in California, had been thinking the same thing. And so we got together, and 4 or 5 of us would drive up to Whittier once a month at night to talk with these folks. And so we formed a board of directors. and were able to employ a man in our Garden Grove Friends Church who had had experience in working with local and state regulations regarding construction. And he was a man who got things done in a hurry, and he set up an office in Whittier to be in contact with some of the folks there in the larger cities in Garden Grove. And eventually this property was purchased. Construction began in 1965, I believe it was, and it became a very well-known and very popular residence especially for Christian folks who wanted that Christian background. And as I mentioned, this had been farm. This property was an orange grove, and in the early days, the property next to it was a 20-acre dairy farm, but it's a school now. But it gave us a very important organization as part of our Friends Church influence and history, and we made I think a very good decision in having it organized, and I've had quite a few friends and relatives staying here over the years, and was able to serve on the board and for many years, and based on the terms of board membership, and in the early 90s, the board organization changed somewhat, but the ministry, of course, continued, and that's the main thing. And also, later in my life, as I mentioned, my first wife died at an early age, and then 2 years later, I was remarried, and my current wife is active in church with me and with a Quaker background. So the Quaker history continues on with our family. And one of my grandsons is active in our church here now, and I told him the other day that he was the fourth generation member of our family to be a member of Garden Grove Friends Church.
That's great.
I think that surprised him.
What are you most proud of having done in your lifetime?
I think being a Christian and being part of a Christian family and being able to enjoy the love and support of Christian family members and friends, and I've had contact with so many people over the years, and those friendships remain strong, and it's very important.
What are 3 things that mean the most to you?
Well, I would say my family, my church, my desire to live a Christian life.
And is there any advice you would like to give to future generations?
Trust in the Lord.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.